Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Bogle Chandler Mystery. On the first morning of 1963, a peaceful Sydney suburb awoke to an eerie mystery. Along the banks of the Lane Cove River, a gentle waterway winding through bushland, two bodies were discovered, lying among the dew-laden grass and mangroves. They were identified as Dr. Gilbert Bogle, a prominent physicist, and Mrs. Margaret Chandler, the wife of one of his colleagues. Both were only partially clothed, and strangely, someone had placed coverings over them. A piece of carpet carefully draped across Dr. Bogle's torso and legs, and cardboard sheeting laid over Mrs. Chandler. There were no obvious wounds or signs of violence. The scene was quiet and perplexing, a tableau of intimacy and death on the soft riverbank, with the gentle burr of the river as the only witness. What should have been a tranquil New Year's Day had instead become the genesis of one of Australia's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. Thus begins the story of the Bogle Chandler case, a baffling tale of a late-night tryst, mysterious sudden death, and decades of speculation. Over 60 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. Yet, as strange and unsettling as the events were, we will explore them here in a slow, measured manner, like a bedtime storyteller guiding you through a dark but intriguing fairy tale. We'll walk calmly through the facts and theory, piece by piece. Our journey will reconstruct the final hours of Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler, drift back through their lives and social world, and then examine the many hypotheses, from exotic poison to Cold War spies and environmental gases, which have been put forward to explain their untimely end. In doing so, we will keep a gentle tone, as soft as the light on the river that morning, even as we delve into an unsettling mystery. Relax and listen as the curtain rises on a true enigma, set against the backdrop of a changing 1960s society. The story unfolds on New Year's Eve 1962, a night of celebration turning into a morning of tragedy. Dr. Gilbert Bogle, also known as Gib, and Margaret Chandler were both attendees at an upscale New Year's Eve gathering in Chatsworth, a quiet, leafy district on Sydney's North Shore. The party was hosted by Ken and Ruth Nash at their home on Waratah Street. Ken Nash was a fellow scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, where Dr. Bogle worked. The guest list included several members of Sydney's scientific and academic circle, dressed festively to welcome the new year. Margaret Chandler arrived at the Nash's party with her husband, Jeffrey Chandler, around 10 p.m. The Chandlers were a handsome young couple in their late 20s with two small children. Jeffrey, a scientific photographer at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, came casually dressed in contrast to the more formally attired crowd. Margaret, petite and poised, mingled among the guests, while Dr. Bogle, gregarious and charming, made his rounds of conversation. Bogle's own wife, Vivian, was also at the party, as were other friends from the close-knit scientific community. It was a convivial scene, music playing softly in the background, glasses clinking with champagne, and voices rising in laughter as midnight approached. Yet beneath the polite chatter, there were undercurrents of complexity in the relationships present. Both the Chandlers and the Bogles were known, at least within their circle, to have liberal arrangements in their marriages. The Chandlers, in particular, subscribed to the ideals of the Sydney Push, a bohemian intellectual subculture that embraced free love and freedom from conventional social scenes. Geoffrey Chandler himself had been unfaithful in the past, and Margaret was painfully aware of his philandering. Rather than destroying their marriage, these indiscretions had led to an unusual understanding between them. In fact, just days earlier at a Christmas gathering, Margaret had confessed to her husband that she found Dr. Bogle quite captivating. Geoffrey, perhaps influenced by his own guilt or by the laissez-faire ethos of their social circle, replied with a remarkable offer. If you want to take Gib as a lover, if it would make you happy, you do it. This was not an angry ultimatum, but a genuine, if unconventional, blessing from a husband who claimed he did not want his wife to feel trapped or unhappy. It was against this backdrop of tacit permissions and hidden desires that the New Year's Eve party carried on. As the clock struck midnight in 1962 turned to 1963, the partygoers at Chadwood raised a toast under a clear summer sky. Fireworks from downtown Sydney might have been visible in the distance, flickering colors on the horizon, but here the atmosphere remained relatively subdued and intimate. Shortly after midnight, Geoffrey Chandler excused himself from the Nash's gathering. He told Margaret and the others that he was stepping out to buy cigarettes. But in truth, his departure had another motive. Geoffrey drove into the night towards the harborside suburb of Bowman, where a ruckus Sydney push party was underway at the home of an academic friend. At that party, Geoffrey met up with a woman named Pamela Logan, with whom he was carrying on an affair. The two slipped away together into the early hours, eventually going to Pamela's flat in Darlington. Geoffrey's New Year's Eve, it seems, was morally unmoored as the arrangement he had granted his wife. Back at the Chadswood party, Margaret was now effectively on her own, though among friends. Gilbert Bogle took note. He was 38 years old, confident and sociable, and he had a reputation for being something of a ladies' man, despite his married status. The handsome physicist and the attractive 28 years old Margaret had struck up a flirtation before. Indeed, perhaps that's why Bogle had suggested the Nash invite the Chandlers to this party in the first place. With Geoffrey's absent, Bogle spent more time in conversation with Margaret as the party thinned out. One can imagine them in a corner of the living room, speaking in low tones as other guests drifted home. Gilbert's wife Vivian was still at the party, but likely occupied with other acquaintances, or perhaps beginning to tire. At around 2:30 a.m., Geoffrey Chandler returned briefly to the Nash's house after parting ways with Pamela Logan. He might have expected to collect Margaret and head home to their children, who were staying that night with grandparents in Granville. By then, however, Margaret was ensconced in easy companionship with Dr. Bogle, and Geoffrey himself did not linger long. In later statements, Geoffrey claimed that he offered to take his wife home, but Bogle volunteered to drive her instead, and Margaret appeared to prefer that arrangement. Geoffrey acquiesced without protest. He reportedly told Margaret that he did not want to leave her in the lurch, but seeing Bogle by her side, he accepted that she was in good company. According to Geoffrey's account, The three of them briefly discussed plans, and it was agreed that Bogle would see Margaret home. Satisfied, Geoffrey took his leave alone. He was seen sitting in his car outside, quietly smoking a cigarette, perhaps collecting his thoughts before he finally drove off into what remained of the night. As 3 a.m. rolled into 4 a.m., only a handful of revelers remained at the Nash's party. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler stayed until very late. They did not depart until around 4 o'clock in the morning. The city was mostly slumbering by then, the summer night air growing cooler and still. Hand in hand or side by side, the pair slipped out into the darkness and climbed into Dr. Bogle's car. Instead of heading directly to Margaret's home, however, they drove a short distance to the nearby Lane Cove River. This area, near Fuller's Bridge, on the river's edge, was known to locals as a lover's lane, a secluded spot where couples seeking privacy would sometimes park or wander into the bush for intimate encounters. Perhaps the two planned to share a few tender moments under the stars before the demands of daylight and reality pulled them back to their separate lives. It was the first morning of a new year. One can imagine a hopeful, if illicit, romantic thrill in the air as Bogle's car came to rest in a small clearing off the road, under the canopy of riverside trees. Leaving the car, Dr. Bogle and Margaret descended a short way into the bush towards the water. The ground near the riverbank formed a shallow depression, ringed by mangroves and shaded by eucalyptus. In the pre-dawn stillness, the world around them would have been hushed. Perhaps only the rhythmic chirr of crickets and the distant hum of the city provided any soundtrack. A light mist often gathers over the Lane Cove River at dawn, lending the undergrowth a dreamlike softness. Here, enveloped by the warm embrace of summer night in the heady rush of newfound intimacy, the two lovers likely shared a private moment. Clothes were loosened or removed in the darkness. They spread a coat or rug on the ground, or perhaps simply laid on the earth. The scene was, for a time, one of passion and secrecy, hidden from the world. Tragically, whatever bliss or excitement they found in those moments was suddenly cut short. Sometime between 4:45 a.m. and daybreak at 6 a.m., both Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler collapsed and died. There were later signs that each had been overtaken by a swift and severe physical distress, evidence of vomiting and loss of bodily control would be found at the scene. Perhaps one of them was stricken first, and the other, alarmed, struggled to assist only to be overcome as well. The details of these final moments seem hazy and have been fiercely debated, but what is certain is that neither Gilbert Bogle nor Margaret Chandler emerged from that riverside hollow alive. As the new day brightened, silence fell over the lovers' lane once more. The two bodies lay not far apart on the sandy soil, amid low shrub, lifeless, oddly at peace in appearance, as if they had simply fallen asleep under the open sky. Above them, the January sun began filtering through the gum leaves, and the city of Sydney stirred, completely unaware of the tragedy tucked away by the quiet river. It was not until around 11 o'clock on the morning of January 1st, 1963, that the stillness of the scene was broken. A group of young boys wandering along the bushy shrub near the riverbank stumbled upon a curious sight. A man's body lying face down on the ground. The location was close to a local golf course, and the boys had been searching for lost golf balls among the bushes, a small New Year's Day adventure. At first glance, they thought the prone figure might be a drunkard sleeping off the previous night's revelry. It was, after all, not unheard of to find an intoxicated soul slumbering in an out-of-the-way spot after New Year's Eve. The boys moved on without much thought, but something about the scene must have nagged at them. About an hour later, they passed by the same spot again and noticed the man was still there, motionless, his face now in an unsettling shade of blue. Realizing this was no ordinary sleep, the boys ran to alert adults and contact the police. When officers arrived at the secluded riverside grove, they quickly identified the man as Dr. Gilbert Bogle. He was lying on his stomach. Even to untrained eyes, it was apparent that he was dead. The first responders were struck by the peculiar state of his attire. Dr. Bogle was naked from the waist down, yet someone had draped his neatly folded trousers over his lower body, as if to cover his modesty. His shoes and socks were still on his feet, oddly incongruous with the disheveled lack of pants. A tweed jacket, later confirmed to be Bogle's own evening jacket, had been placed carefully over his back. Under the jacket, a piece of carpet or rug had been laid atop him. The placement of these items seemed deliberate, almost gentle, as though a concerned passerby had attempted to tidy up the scene. The police noted immediately that this covering could not have been done by Bogle himself in any dying act. It suggested the intervention of a third party after death. As the investigators fanned out, they made a second grim discovery a short distance away. About 12 to 15 meters from Dr. Bogle's body, on the same stretch of riverbank, they found the half-naked body of a woman. She was lying on her back amid some cardboard boxes and pieces of paper. Her clothing, too, was in disarray. Her blouse or top had been removed, and her skirt or undergarment were not properly on her. In a manner similar to Bogle, her body had been covered post-mortem. Broken up cardboard beer cartons had been arranged to conceal her exposed torso. This woman was soon identified as Margaret Chandler. Both victims were beyond help, their skin cooled in the summer heat and showing lividity. A constable carefully checked for any sign of life, but there were none. The strange positioning of makeshift materials over the bodies gave the scene a surreal, unsettling aspect. It was as if some phantom Good Samaritan had chanced upon the couple's corpse, and in a moment of pity or panic, decided to preserve their dignity in death. The immediate surrounding yielded a few clues and many questions. Articles of clothing, presumably shed by the couple during their intimate encounter, were found scattered near the water's edge, which at low tide exposed muddy patches of riverbank. There were traces of vomit near both bodies, in evidence that both Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler had lost control of their bowels before death. These signs strongly indicated some kind of poisoning or toxic reaction, yet there were no containers, syringes, or obvious sources of poison in the vicinity. The ground showed some disturbed earth, a few scuff marks and impressions that looked like knee and shoe prints, suggesting that the pair might have suddenly staggered or crawled in distress before collapsing. Notably, neither body bore any stab wounds, gunshot injuries, or blunt trauma. There were no signs of a struggle between the two of them, no bruises from a fight, no defensive wounds. The lovers had not been attacked in any obvious physical manner, nor had they harmed each other. It was as if death had simply caught them unawares. Police quickly sealed off the area. What had begun as a tranquil holiday morning for local law enforcement was now a potential crime scene of great intrigue. By midday, as news trickled out over police radios and among journalists, the media was already descending on Lane Cove in force. The bizarre and scandalous elements of the discovery, a respected scientist and a married woman found dead together in a lover's lane, virtually guaranteed sensational coverage. Indeed, within hours, the case would dominate headlines and captivate the public's imagination in Sydney and beyond. But first, the authorities had to do their work methodically. Photographs were taken of the scene, images of the bodies lying covered amid the reeds and dirt, the detective and coroner bending over with puzzled expressions. These would later feed the morbid fascinations of newspaper readers. The coroner, Mr. J.J. Looms, attended in person to view the setting firsthand, a sign of how seriously the investigation was being treated from the onset. One initial theory the police considered, given the careful covering of the bodies, was that perhaps Margaret, seeing Bogle collapse, had in confusion tried to cover him, then wandered off and died herself. However, the logistics of that seem implausible. How could she have then covered herself so completely with cardboard before succumbing? The arrangement of the coverings, especially on Margaret's body, appeared too neat to have been done by someone in the throes of a deadly medical crisis. It became clear to investigators that an unknown third person had likely come upon the scene after the couple's demise. This person had not harmed them, so far as could be told, but had taken the unusual step of modestly concealing their partial nudity. The police canvassed for any witnesses in the vicinity that morning, and soon got a curious lead. A man came forward, twice contacting police under different names, claiming to have information. He was a known voyeur who frequented lovers' lanes. After interrogation, though, he was dismissed. His story did not hold up, and he seemed to be seeking attention. Another individual of interest emerged, a local greyhound trainer who routinely exercised his dog on a path near the river at dawn. Investigators learned that on New Year's morning, the man's car had indeed been seen in the area. When questioned, he denied noticing anything unusual and claimed he took a different route that day. However, inconsistencies plagued his account. Years later, a newspaper obituary for this greyhound trainer contained a startling assertion. It stated that he had been the first to find Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler's bodies. This hint, along with whispers from those who knew him, suggested that he had discovered the dead couple and had covered them out of a sense of propriety. Supporting this, a woman who, as a child, lived in the area, came forward after seeing a documentary on the case in 2006, claiming she had found Mrs. Chandler's missing handbag discarded in bushland a few kilometers away, near property linked to the greyhound man's family. These pieces, assembled long after 1963, paint a likely scenario. The greyhound trainer happened upon the tragic scene in the early morning, was perhaps horrified or concerned about decency, and decided to cover the bodies and remove the lady's handbag, possibly to prevent identification or simply out of panic, then left without reporting it. In 1963, however, without his admission, the police could only speculate. The gentle arrangement of clothing and debris on the victims remained an enigmatic footnote to the central mystery. How and why did these two people die? As the day progressed on January 1st, 1963, News of the double death by the Lane Cove River spread rapidly. By the following morning, Sydney's newspapers blazed with sensational headlines, and curious details of the victims' identities and relationships began to surface. In a socially conservative era, the revelation that Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler were not married to each other, yet had died together in circumstances suggesting intimacy, was titillating and scandalous. Here was a tale seemingly ripped from a crime novel. A brilliant scientist, in the midst of a secret tryst with a young mother, with no obvious cause of death. The press had a field day. They splashed the story on front pages, emphasizing every salacious angle: mysterious lover's lane death, hints of extramarital affairs, and a baffled police force with no murder weapon. The public, hungry for answers, became armchair detectives overnight. In homes and pubs across Australia, people buzzed about the Lover's Lane murders or the Bogle Chandler mystery, speculating about poisons and assignations in equal measure. For those who knew the victims, these media narratives were jarring. Dr. Gilbert Stanley Bogle, who was not some shadowy libertine figure, he was a highly respected scientist on the cusp of an illustrious international career. At 38, he had accomplished more than most do in a lifetime. Bogle was born in New Zealand in 1924, and his prodigious intellect was evident from an early age. So exceptional was he in physics that during World War II, he was excused from military service so he could continue his studies. His mind was deemed as valuable to the nation as a soldier's arm. Awarded a prestigious Rhodes Scholarship, Bogle went on to Oxford University's Oriel College in England, where he distinguished himself in the field of low-temperature physics and subatomic research. He earned his doctorate swiftly and published work that became required reading for other scientists. Colleagues praised his mental powers and original ideas, noting that he was both theoretically insightful and a brilliant hands-on experimenter. By the time he returned to the Southern Hemisphere in the mid-1950s, Bogle had married Vivian, a school teacher he met in university, and started a family which would eventually include 3, later 4 children. Dr. Bogle took up a post at the CSIRO's National Standards Laboratory in Sydney in 1956. There, he threw himself into cutting-edge research on masers, microwave amplifiers, and early technology related to lasers, and quickly garnered acclaim. His superiors fast-tracked his promotion, describing him glowingly, noteworthy for his breadth of knowledge, capacity for original ideas, drive, and enthusiasm. By 1962, the division chief deemed Bogle the most brilliant member of the staff. Such was Bogle's talent that Bell Telephone Laboratories in the United States offered him a position in their emerging field of quantum electronics. He accepted, and the CSIROs granted him a 2-year leave. He and his family were literally weeks away from leaving Australia for New Jersey in January 1963. In short, Gilbert Bogle was a rising star in science, poised for international achievement. He was also, by many accounts, personable and charismatic, a real live wire, as one colleague puts it, the kind of man who lit up a room with both intellect and humor. However, he had a personal life that was more bohemian than the public might have expected of a buttoned-down scientist. It later emerged that Dr. Bogle had engaged in casual romantic liaisons with multiple women during his time in Sydney. He and his wife Vivian were perhaps not strictly monogamous, whether by agreement or quiet consent. Bogle's extramarital dalliance seemed to have been tolerated. The Sydney push scene, which advocated free love, was an influence in their social circle. Bogle's inclination to meet lovers in parks and secluded spots was even known to a few close friends. Still, to the wider world, he was principally known as a family man and a genius in the laboratory. Margaret Olive Chandler, at 28, had a very different background, though she moved in similar social sphere by marriage. Born in 1934 in suburban Sydney, Margaret was the eldest daughter of a respectable family and the older sister of Tony Morfitt, who would later become a well-known screenwriter. Described as gentle and caring, Margaret trained and worked as a nurse in her youth. In 1957, at age 23, she married Geoffrey Chandler in a Presbyterian church ceremony on Christmas Eve. Geoffrey was a few years older and employed as a scientific photographer at Ciro's. That is how Margaret eventually crossed paths with Dr. Bogle. The Chandlers settled into domestic life in the late 1950s, welcoming 2 children and presenting the image of a happy young family in Sydney's western suburbs. Yet beneath the veneer, Margaret grew increasingly discontent. Geoffrey's work life placed them in the orbit of intellectuals and avant-garde thinkers, including the Sydney University crowd and the libertarian push. Geoffrey himself became involved with the push, embracing its counterculture ideas that challenged conservative norms and encouraged sexual freedom. Along with this came personal indiscretions. Geoffrey had multiple affairs during the early years of their marriage. These were not flamboyant or publicly known, but eventually Margaret became aware of her husband's unfaithfulness. It hurt her deeply. In an era when divorce was stigmatized, and women often had little recourse if their husbands strayed, Margaret inwardly fumed and felt trapped by the expectations of being a dutiful wife and mother. By late 1962, however, change was in the air for Margaret. She found herself drawn to the vivacious and brilliant Dr. Bogle when they met socially. Perhaps his worldliness and charm were a tonic to the frustrations she felt at home. According to later witness accounts, including Geoffrey's own testimony, Margaret openly admired Bogle after a pre-Christmas barbecue where they had chatted at length. She told Geoffrey that Gib Boggles is very nice in a way that implied she was smitten. Geoffrey's response, encouraging her to pursue an affair if she wished, was extraordinary, but in keeping with the permissive philosophy he espoused. For Margaret, who may have felt stifled by years of playing the conventional role, this was like being handed a key to a door she had long peered at but never tried. She was, as friends would later put it, likely bored with her life as a suburban housewife, and still upset at her husband's betrayal. The idea of an affair with Dr. Bogle held both emotional allure and a measure of poetic justice. In the eyes of 1963 society, these revelations about the private lives of Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler were explosive. The coroner's inquest, which convened in the months after their deaths, became a media circus precisely because of the hint of wife swapping and the bohemian bedroom politics involved. One newspaper at the time even ran with a lurid angle that the covered bodies suggested some death ritual, reflecting the struggle of a conservative public to make sense of such an unusual scenario. Some newspaper printed scandalized summaries of the free love practices of the Sydney push, casting the tragedy as a kind of moral fable as if the wages of sin had come due on that New Year's dawn. But amidst the sensationalism, there was also deep bewilderment and concern. Two healthy young people had simply died without explanation. Moral judgments aside, everyone wanted to know what on earth had killed them. For investigators, the top priority was to determine the cause of death. Autopsies on Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler were performed, with some delay because New Year's Day was a public holiday, which slowed down the forensic examination by about 36 hours. Pathologists carefully checked for any signs of internal trauma, illness, or toxic substances. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. Both Bogle and Chandler were found to have died from what the coroner would term acute circulatory failure. Essentially, their hearts and breathing had stopped suddenly. But what caused that failure remained a mystery. There was no evidence of heart disease or pre-existing medical conditions severe enough to explain two simultaneous deaths. Chemical tests for known poisons in their blood, stomach contents, and tissues came up negative. Common drugs or alcohol were not present in lethal quantities. No lethal amounts of cyanide, arsenic, strychnine, or other standard toxins were detected. The forensic team even looked at exotic possibilities, like funnel web spiders or cone shell neurotoxin, things that could, in theory, kill swiftly. But there were no bite marks or signs of such envenomations, and these theories seemed far-fetched. Investigators collected soil and water samples from the scene, thinking perhaps an environmental toxin or gas might be responsible. But at the time, they lacked clear evidence of anything unusual. One major avenue was carefully explored. Could this have been a double suicide or a suicide pact? Detectives examined that possibility by searching for any suicide notes or indications that either Bogle or Chandler intended self-harm. Nothing of the sort was found in their personal effects or histories. Both had been seen in good spirits at the party and had made plans for the future. Bogle certainly was on the verge of an exciting move to the U.S. There was no signs they had ingested a poison voluntarily. No bottles or pills at the site, and it would be odd to say the least, for two people to choose such an elaborative and secretive way to die together, with no message left behind. Could it have been a crime of passion or jealousy? Naturally, suspicion initially swirled around Margaret's husband, Jeffrey Chandler. It is a Time-War truism that the spouse is the first suspect in cases of mysterious deaths. Here was a man whose wife died while apparently being unfaithful. However, the more the police learned about Jeffrey, the less traditional this scenario appeared. During interviews, Jeffrey Chandler was remarkably candid about his open relationship with Margaret. He freely admitted he had known and effectively permitted her to take up with Bogle. At the inquest in May 1963, Jeffrey testified that he and his wife had an understanding and that he recounted the conversation where he'd essentially sanctioned her liaison with Dr. Bogle. This openness stunned many, but it also served to reduce the suspicion on him. It was hard to cast him as a man enraged by jealousy when he spoke so calmly of encouraging his wife's affair. Moreover, Jeffrey had a solid alibi during the likely time of death. He was with Pamela Logan, his own lover, in the early hours of New Year's, and only returned home around dawn. In fact, he told authorities that he arrived home alone and went to sleep, which technically left a window of time unaccounted around 5 a.m. But Pamela and others confirmed he had been nowhere near Lane Cove during the critical time frame. At the inquest, Jeffrey's cool, somewhat indifferent demeanor did raise a few eyebrows. Some observers noted that he appeared unemotional and detached while recounting these intimate matters, which to some looked like the callousness of a guilty man. The press subtly hinted at his stoicism, fueling public speculation, yet no evidence directly linked him to the deaths. By the end of the inquest, the coroner did not consider Jeffrey Chandler a culprit, and investigators had found no indication he was involved in any foul play. Still, gossip dies hard. Many in the public remained unconvinced, prompting Jeffrey to publish a book in 1969 titled "So You Think I Did It," in which he tried to finally clear his name and share his side of the story. Another potential suspect that police quietly scrutinized was one of Dr. Bogle's former lovers. There was a woman named Margaret Fowler, a librarian with scientific training, who had been in a relationship with Bogle for 3 years prior to his involvement with Margaret Chandler. Miss Fowler had recently been spurned. Bogle had broken off their affair, and one might imagine she could have held a grudge. Importantly, as a librarian in a scientific environment, Fowler would have had access to knowledge of obscure chemicals or poisons, making her a person of interest in a poisoning scenario. Police interviewed her and considered the possibility that a jealous ex-mistress might have administered some untraceable toxin to the couple. However, no evidence emerged to implicate Fowler either. She cooperated with investigators, and nothing concrete tied her to the events of that night. Increasingly, Margaret Fowler later floated her own theory of the deaths. She speculated that Bogle and Chandler's demise was related to chemical warfare research. Why she believed this is not fully documented, but it hints that even those close to the victims were grasping at straws. Perhaps she suspected Bogle had enemies or had stumbled upon dangerous secrets, an idea we will explore shortly when we discuss espionage theories. In any case, the police could not build a case around Fowler or any other acquaintance. There were no secret love potion or vials of nerve agent found in her possession, and her whereabouts on New Year's Eve did not arouse suspicion. Faced with a vacuum of evidence, the coroner's court was left to deliver a most unsatisfying conclusion. At the inquest, after hearing weeks of testimony from witnesses, experts, and investigators, Coroner Loom summed up the outcome in a single dry pronouncement. Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler died from acute circulatory failure, but as to the circumstances under which such circulatory failure was brought about, the evidence does not permit me to say. In plain language, their hearts stopped, but nobody could determine why. It was the equivalent of shrugging in legal terms, an official admission of bafflement. The deaths were recorded, but not explained. Such an open verdict did little to quell public curiosity. If anything, it intensified the aura of mystery around the case. The phrase Bogle and Chandler became synonymous with puzzles that defy logic. Sydney society, which had been momentarily scandalized by the bohemian private lives on display, now found itself both titillated and uneasy. Was there a killer at large who could strike without trace? Or was this a freak accident of nature? The lack of closure spawned endless conjecture. In the months and years that followed, every imaginative solution one could think of was tossed into the ring of debate. Some Sydney residents whispered that it must have been a strange sex game gone wrong, an assignation that veered into dangerous territory, though they could not articulate how. This was perhaps influenced by other infamous cases or prurient interests, but it didn't fit the evidence. There were no injuries or signs of violence, and certainly no indication of implement or bondages that such a game might apply. Others posited that maybe the lovers had taken some sort of exotic aphrodisiac or drug to enhance their experience, which accidentally poisoned them. Given the era, the early 1960s, a few names came up. Spanish fly, a notorious but dangerous purported aphrodisiac, or perhaps some kind of rare herb. Police did consider this angle. Toxicologists looked for traces of known stimulating or illicit substances, but again found nothing conclusive. One theory that gained quite a bit of popular traction was the LSD theory, that Bogle and Chandler had ingested the hallucinogenic drug LSD during the party or afterward, and that it had caused the fatal reaction. LSD was fairly new and enigmatic substance in the early 1960s, just beginning to leak into public awareness, often associated with secretive experiments or the counterculture. By the time of the deaths, LSD was not widely available recreationally, but it wasn't impossible to obtain. The police took this theory seriously enough to investigate it. They learned of rumors that some serial researchers or someone in their orbit might have clandestinely manufactured LSD in a laboratory. If true, perhaps Bogle and Chandler had decided to try this novel psychedelic drug during their private escapade, and perhaps an overdose or a tainted batch had killed them. At the inquest and in subsequent analyses, the LSD hypothesis stood out as a plausible scenario, mainly because LSD would have been untraceable by the toxicology tests of 1963. It was known that standard screenings wouldn't catch it. For decades, absent of a better answer, some investigators leaned towards LSD as the favored explanation, assuming because the couple either voluntarily took a high dose or were unwittingly dosed. However, there were counterpoints. LSD in pure form is not generally lethal. By the late 1980s, it was well documented that there had been no confirmed human deaths from an LSD overdose. People might have accidents under its influence, but the drug itself typically doesn't stop one's heart. Moreover, LSD tends to cause long, drawn-out hallucinations, not the kind of sudden collapse seen in this case. Bogle and Chandler's abrupt sickness and death didn't match what one would expect from an acid trip gone wrong. No reports of them acting bizarre or freaked out prior to collapse. To settle lingering doubts, in 1996, over 30 years later, samples of tissues that had been preserved from Bogle and Chandler were sent to the United States for advanced testing. By then, forensic science had tools capable of detecting LSD in old specimens. The first scan of their tissue did show a vague signal that might indicate something like LSD. This caused a stir. Could the mystery be solved after all these years? But a second, more sensitive test on the same sample came back negative. In the end, the 1996 analysis concluded that neither victim had ingested LSD. Thus, the psychedelic theory largely fell apart under scrutiny. It appears likely that LSD was a red herring, a product of the 1960s zeitgeist and the desperation to pin the blame on something. As one scientific review noted, LSD overdose is an implausible cause of death in general, and in this case, it simply did not fit the facts. Meanwhile, other theories bordered on fantastical. One imaginative idea posited that a piece of dry ice was used to release carbon dioxide gas and suffocated the couple, perhaps as part of some bizarre prank or experimental murder. Dry ice sublimates into carbon dioxide gas, which, in a confined space, can displace oxygen. However, out in the open air by a river, it's hard to see how dry ice could kill two people without them noticing. CO2 in high concentration causes distress that would likely prompt escape. No evidence of dry ice was found, and this theory was eventually discarded alongside other fringe ideas. Some suspected natural toxins. One suggestion was poisoning via shellfish toxin, like perhaps the couple had eaten contaminated seafood and succumbed hours later. Yet neither had consumed such a meal that anyone knew of that night. And food poisoning severe enough to kill both at the same time would likely have been evident in the autopsy. The environment itself presented hazard. Sydney's bush and waterways are home to venomous creatures. The deadly funnel web spider, for instance, could in theory deliver a fatal bite. But two people being bitten to death simultaneously by spiders in the night with no bite marks found stretched credulity. The same issue applied to venomous conch shells or snakes, highly unlikely to get both victims at the same moment with no trace. It seemed that every path led to a dead end. The Cold War espionage theory, however, offered an entirely different kind of explanation, one that many found compelling given the era's political climate and the lack of conventional poison. Let us now gently step into the shadowy realm of spies, secrets, and paranoia that colored the Bogle Chandler case. In 1963, the world had just emerged from the harrowing brink of the Cuban Missile Crisis, only 3 months prior, and the Cold War hung heavy on the global atmosphere. Australia, though far from the epicenters of Washington and Moscow, was very much entwined in Cold War politics. It hosted American military communication bases, worked on scientific projects with defense implications, and had its own nascent spy agencies allied with Britain and the US. When two people died mysteriously, with no traceable poison, some minds turned to the possibility of nerve gas or secret weapon, something out of a clandestine laboratory, wielded by Cold War operatives. It did not help that Dr. Bogle's work was in advanced physics and that he was about to depart for a cutting-edge lab in America. Could he have been a target? The notion of espionage in the Bogle-Chandler case took on several forms over the years, evolving as new tidbits came to light. Initially, police themselves did reach out internationally due to the baffling nature of the deaths. They consulted experts at New Scotland Yard in Britain and even the FBI in the United States. These agencies were asked if they recognized any similar cases or if they had any insight into exotic assassination methods that might have little trace. It was reported that intelligence channels were quietly probed. After all, if this was a spy plot, local law enforcement wanted guidance. But nothing concrete emerged from these inquiries. If Western intelligence knew something, they did not tip their hands to Sydney police. However, in the febrile environment of public speculation, several dramatic theories flourished. 1. The assassination to silence Bogle, the atomic secrets theory. One theory suggested that Dr. Bogle was murdered because he knew too much or was about to expose sensitive information. According to allegations later publicized by a woman named Catherine Dalton, the widow of a scientist who had worked with nuclear research, and echoed by Margaret Fowler and even Jeffrey Chandler himself, Bogle might have been preparing to blow the whistle on some clandestine matters. Specifically, the story went that Bogle had knowledge of security leaks at the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, and possibly wrongdoings by American intelligence operatives in Australia. If he was going to reveal these secrets, perhaps once he got to the United States or perhaps to the press, then those threatened could have decided to eliminate him. Under this theory, Margaret Chandler was merely a tragic collateral damage. She was with him at the wrong time and had to be silenced because she was a witness. This scenario imagines a cloak and dagger operation where agents deployed a sophisticated poison or nerve agent to swiftly kill Bogle and anyone with him, leaving little evidence behind. It's the stuff of spy novels with shadowy figures watching the lovers from a bush before making their lethal move. Is there any evidence for it? Hard proof is lacking, but a few things lent the theory of a near possibility. Bogle's scientific work wasn't directly weapons related, but he was a prominent figure in the scientific community and potentially privy to conversations or gossip about defense research. The involvement of international police agencies in the investigation, even in the advisory capacity, suggested something beyond the ordinary. And indeed, as later memoirs revealed, Western agencies did have an interest in exotic assassination methods. For example, the CIA's research into poison darts, and the KGB's notorious methods like the umbrella gun, used in the 1978 Markov assassination. Could a nerve gas or rare toxin have been sprayed or injected into Bogle and Chandler? Perhaps a Cold War spy had followed them, or an agent within the party introduced something into their drinks. These ideas were chilling, but perhaps comforting to some who prefer to blame human intrigue rather than random chance. 2. The mistaken identity or wrong man theory. Another angle was raised by none other than Jeffrey Chandler in later years. In a twist worthy of le Carre thriller, Jeffrey speculated that if British intelligence was involved, they might have killed Bogle thinking he was a spy, when in fact he wasn't. This line of thought stems from revelations in the 1980s by Peter Wright, a former MI5 officer who wrote the book Spycatcher. Wright claimed that Sir Roger Hollis, a top MI5 official, suspected by some of being a Soviet mole, had once recommended Gilbert Bogle for a position at the Australian Security Intelligence Organization. If Hollis was indeed a Soviet spy, a controversial and unproven claim, then anyone he vouched for could fall under suspicion of also being a Soviet asset. In other words, someone in Western intelligence might have thought Bogle was tied to the KGB or communist networks and decided to neutralize him as a potential traitor. Under this scenario, the tragedy was essentially a case of the wrong man at the wrong time. If Bogle had any connection to espionage, it was tangential, but he got caught in the gears of international spy hunting. Again, Margaret's presence would have been incidental and unfortunate. These espionage theories made for a gripping conversation, and they weren't entirely dismissible. The use of unidentified nerve agent was considered at one point during the early investigation. Could some rare chemical, maybe something like sarin or then experimental compound, had been released near the victims. If expertly done, it might cause death without leaving the typical residue, or cause that standard toxicology could detect in 1963. Indeed, decades later, when autopsy reports were revisited by experts like Dr. Thomas Milby, a U.S. toxicologist consulted for the 2006 documentary, he noted that the findings suggested an inhaled poison rather than an ingested one. This dovetailed with either an environmental gas or a covert attack via gas. Dr. Milby observed that both victims' blood had unusual bluish-purple tinge, a sign that it's consistent with some form of asphyxiation or blood agent poisoning. Despite their intrigue, no concrete evidence of espionage has ever been uncovered in this case. If agents were involved, they covered their tracks perfectly. No suspicious figures were reported lurking around the party or the river. Bogle's known associates in Margaret's circle had no links to espionage that anyone could find. In the end, official investigators, while not ruling anything out, leaned away from the spy theory due to lack of proof. International checks did not implicate Bogle in espionage, and no intelligence agency stepped forward with any hint of involvement. As years passed, the espionage hypothesis moved into a realm of conspiracy lore. It exemplified the era's mindset. The Cold War made people believe even the most fantastical plot might be real. The Bogle-Chandler mystery became something of a blank slate onto which one could project secret agent fantasies or fears. For a time, especially in the late 1960s and 1970s, Bogle and Chandler became shorthand in Australia for puzzling death and possible cover-up. It joined the ranks of other enduring Aussie mysteries, like the Somerton Man case of 1948, that seemed like they might have hidden Cold War underpinnings. People would debate in letters to the editor in pub chats. Was it murder by spycraft or just misadventure? With the investigation officially at a standstill and no answers forthcoming, the case slipped gradually from breaking news into historical enigma. But it never fully left the public consciousness. Every so often, a new tip or claim would jolt it back to life in the headlines, and armchair detectives would revisit the familiar catalog of theories until something quite unexpected emerged many decades later, breathing new life and a plausible solution into this cold case. The rotten egg gas revelation. For over 40 years, the Bogle-Chandler case remained the ultimate whodunit, or rather, what done it, lacking any definitive answer. Then, in 2006, an Australian filmmaker and investigative journalist named Peter Butt released a documentary that proposed a solution both startling and strangely prosaic. Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler, he argued, had been killed not by a person at all, but by an environmental accident. The true culprit, according to his theory, was hydrogen sulfide gas, the very sort of foul, rotten egg-smelling gas that bubbles up from stagnant, polluted waterways. The documentary titled Who Killed Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler aired on the ABC network in September 2006 and immediately reignited public fascination. Peter Butt's hypothesis was in fact not entirely new. A few people had considered it and set the idea aside back in the early 1970s, but Butt brought fresh evidence and compelling narrative to support it. Let us unfold this theory carefully, for it provides a calm yet dramatic resolution that fits many of the perplexing pieces of the puzzle. The key lies in the location itself, the Lane Cove River near Fuller's Bridge, where Bogle and Chandler died and in the history of that river's ecology. Butt's research uncovered archival reports that in the mid-20th century, residents along the Lane Cove River had frequently complained about a nasty problem, a strong, nauseating, rotten egg smell emanating from the water, especially on still days. This odor is the hallmark of hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas that can result from the bacterial breakdown of organic matter in oxygen-poor environments, such as the mud of a polluted riverbed. Lane Cove River, it turns out, had been the dumping ground for industrial waste and sewage for decades. A flour mill upstream had poured millions of liters of effluent into the river since the 1890s. By the 1940s and 50s, parts of the river were so polluted that fish were dying en masse, and the stench was sometimes overwhelming. The Maritime Service Board conducted a study and found that in sections of the river, especially near a certain weir that trapped water flow, the bottom mud was saturated to a depth of 50 centimeters with hydrogen sulfide gas. Under certain conditions, large pockets of this gas could be released suddenly from the riverbed, burping into the air in concentrated cloud. The worst affected area, tellingly, was within a quarter mile of that weir, precisely in the vicinity where Bogle and Chandler met their end. Consider now the conditions of the early hours of January 1st, 1963. It was a cool night, and by pre-dawn, the air was likely very still. No breeze, a typical summer dawn lull. Such calm conditions would allow any heavier-than-air gas to pool and linger near the ground. Hydrogen sulfide is denser than normal air, and if released in quantity, will hug low-lying areas until wind disperses. Bogle and Chandler chose a spot at water level, in a slight depression by the river, and they were literally lying close to the ground, possibly in a hollow surrounded by natural embankment and mangroves. If one were to design a worst-case scenario for encountering a pocket of rogue gas, this setting was it. Hydrogen sulfide has insidious properties. At low concentrations, it produces a strong odor of rotten eggs, unmistakable and unpleasant. But at higher concentrations, above roughly 100 parts per million, it deadens the human sense of smell by paralyzing the olfactory nerves. In other words, a person could be enveloped in a lethal dose and no longer smell the warning sign. Furthermore, hydrogen sulfide is a potent chemical asphyxiant. At around 200 parts per million, it can induce unconsciousness and respiratory failure in seconds. At 1,000 parts per million, a single breath can trigger immediate cardiac arrest. Victims of high concentration of hydrogen sulfide poisoning often collapse on the spot, sometimes with a telltale purple discoloration of the blood due to the changes in hemoglobin. In rapid onset of rigor due to muscle contractions. Peter Butt's documentary laid out a scenario in which, sometime near dawn, an underwater event occurred upstream, perhaps a disturbance in the anoxic mud or a change in pressure, releasing a large bolus of hydrogen sulfide gas. This poisonous cloud would have slithered along the surface of the water, creeping into the depression where the couple lay. Being engaged in intimate activity, they might have initially noticed a whiff of something foul, but perhaps did not immediately react, or the gas concentration may have risen rapidly from barely detectable to overwhelming. One toxicologist in the documentary speculated that if the gas seeped in gradually, the couple might have habituated to the smell, olfactory fatigue, or attributed to the normal swampy odor, especially if they were distracted by each other. Another possibility is that the concentration was so high so quickly that after about 1 or 2 breaths, they lost consciousness before they could even attempt escape. The evidence supporting this theory is striking when viewed in total. Historical reports. There is documented evidence of hydrogen sulfide issues in that exact area, including letters from residents and a formal study detailing dangerous gas release. Lane Cove's history makes it plausible that a deadly hydrogen sulfide incident could occur. Environmental conditions. The weather that morning was described as cool and still, perfect for gas accumulation. The spot where Bogle and Chandler went was low-lying and surrounded by natural barriers, so any heavy gas would settle there. Physical evidence at the scene. Slight abrasions on the victims' bodies in the scuffed earth suggest they suddenly became disoriented and struggled to get up or move, likely in panic. They didn't get far, indicating a rapid collapse. Importantly, their state of undress remained. They hadn't managed to redress or even fully pull up their garments, implying they were struck down in the middle of their actions without warning. If a poison had been slower acting, one might expect them to attempt to dress or run, but here it seems they were overcome almost instantaneously. Autopsy clues. The autopsy noted odd purple patches on the skin of both Bogle and Chandler, and, as Dr. Milby pointed out, a purple or bluish cast in their blood sample. This is characteristic of hydrogen sulfide poisoning, which causes a form of oxygen deprivation at the cellular level that can turn blood a dark purple, different from the cherry pink of carbon monoxide poisoning or the blue of cyanosis. In 1963, the pathologist saw this but didn't know how to interpret it. Had they considered hydrogen sulfide at the time, it might have clicked. No lasting traces. Hydrogen sulfide leaves very little trace once it dissipates. It is a gas that can vanish into the atmosphere and also can be produced in small amounts by a decomposing body itself, which is why one expert cautioned that such a gas could be an artifact in autopsy considerations if the body wasn't fresh. The long delay before testing, remember 36 hours due to the holiday, and then the lack of specific tests for hydrogen sulfide, meant that this cause would not have been caught. In fact, the forensic toxicologist in 1963 did not test for it. He later said that he had known about the sexual activity, the semen evidence. He would have ruled out many poisons that cause slow onset symptoms and might have thought to suspect a gas like hydrogen sulfide. If one had suspected it, how to prove it? Even today, detecting hydrogen sulfide after the fact is extremely challenging unless you directly catch it in the environment at the time. Budd's documentary not only presented these points, it also dramatized them, recreating the scene with actors to illustrate how silently and quickly gas can fell two people. He even tracked down individuals with knowledge of similar incidents. It turns out, cases of environmental hydrogen sulfide poisoning have indeed been recorded. In Japan, for instance, there have been rare instances of people near volcanic lakes or hot springs suddenly collapsing from natural hydrogen sulfide emissions. In Australia, too, there were accounts of lakes belching toxic gas. One example mentioned was a lake in Queensland that in the 1970s released hydrogen sulfide, sickening some people in the vicinity, though not killing them. So the phenomenon, while rare, was real. Crucially, Butt discovered that the hydrogen sulfide theory had actually been considered by some Australian police officers years after the case. In 1971, a police investigator named Inspector Harry Bodie revisited the Bogle Chandler file and posited that the poisonous gas from the river could be the answer. He even did some inquiries, but lacking support and hard proof, the idea was shelved at that time. It languished in the discarded theory pile until Butt took it up with modern research tools. The documentary's impact was significant. Many viewers, even some experts, found the explanation persuasive, elegant in its simplicity, and fully consistent with the lack of other evidence. Of course, some toxicologists remained skeptical. One pathologist pointed out a logical question. How did they not smell it and flee? Sure, hydrogen sulfide stinks, but this was addressed by noting the olfactory paralysis effect and the possibility of gradual exposure dulling the senses. Also recall that Bogle and Chandler may have indeed smelled something, but were in a compromised situation. By the time either might have thought we should leave, they might have already been dizzy. Hydrogen sulfide in high concentration acts so fast that victims often literally crumble where they stand. Another expert in environmental toxicology, while admitting the scenario was plausible, felt it was a bit far-fetched as singular cause for such a dramatic event. He acknowledged, as did all, that this was not a common way to die. Hydrogen sulfide accidents are usually industrial, workers entering manure pits, for example. Yet, he didn't rule it out, he just voiced caution. In the wake of the documentary, calls grew to have the case formally revisited. The New South Wales Police and Coroner's Office were given all the new information. Indeed, the ABC program 7.30 ran a segment in 2016, 10 years later, revealing that Peter Butt had learned of two potential eyewitnesses to the death. An anonymous retired psychologist came forward to say that back in 1965, a woman had confided in him that she and her female partner saw what happened on that New Year's dawn. These two women had been near the river, possibly also seeking a private moment, given they were a lesbian couple at a time when relationships as such were stigmatized, when they observed a man and woman down by the water's edge. According to the second-hand account, the women watched from a distance as the couple engaged in intimate activity, when suddenly both collapsed. The observing women reportedly smelled a strong rotten egg odor at the moment. Frightened and fearing exposure of their own secret relationship, they never reported it to authorities. One of the women later told the story obliquely to the psychologist, who decades later realized the significance when he saw Butt's film. In 2016, Butt and others hoped to locate these witnesses, who would likely be in their 70s by then. Even half a century on, such eyewitness accounts could be a game changer, lending tremendous weight to the hydrogen sulfide theory. As of the last updates, those witnesses had not publicly come forward, and no reopened coroner's inquest has yet delivered an official ruling incorporating the new evidence. But the weight of probability in many people's mind has shifted. After hearing the hydrogen sulfide explanation, one might sigh with relief. At last, a logical answer that doesn't require spies or supernatural poisons. It does, however, add a poignantly random aspect to the tragedy. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler were, if this is correct, not killed by any human hand or by their own folly, but by a chance encounter with nature's toxic plume, a consequence of pollution and unfortunate timing. There is even a melancholy irony here. Had they chosen a different spot along the riverbank, or lingered at the party a bit longer, arriving perhaps after the gas release happened, or left even 5 minutes earlier, they might have lived. The stars aligned in the worst possible way for them that night. In a sense, it's almost Shakespearean, a fatal mischance at the climax of a forbidden romance. Though the hydrogen sulfide hypothesis stands as the most convincing solution to the Bogle-Chandler mystery, officially, the case remains unsolved. There has been no definitive court-sanctioned determination of the cause of their deaths. In the record of unsolved Australian mysteries, their names still appear, footnoted with whatever theory the writer prefers. For the public, however, the allure of the story has always been about more than just the chemical puzzle. It's the human elements, the social taboos, and the era's contrast between prim decorum and private liberations that make it unforgettable. In 1963, Australia was on the cusp of great social change. The Bogle-Chandler case, in a way, foreshadowed the cultural shifts that would come later in the decade. The open marriage and free love aspects, once scandalous, might be seen today with more understanding eye, or even curiosity about the Sydney push milieu that encouraged such relationships. At the time, though, it challenged the status quo. Many Australians never imagined that respectable married couple might consensually swap partners or take lovers with their spouse's knowledge. The case forced these conversations into living rooms and newspapers, if only in hushed or morally tinged tones. It highlighted a subculture of intellectual libertines living right alongside mainstream suburbia. The image of the brilliant scientist, who by stereotype should have been a staid, pipe-smoking family man, revealed as a pleasure seeker with multiple lovers, also chipped away at certain norms. In Margaret's role, as a woman who bravely, some say brazenly, followed her desires despite societal expectations, made her vilified by some and admired by others. In death, she couldn't speak for herself, and unfortunately, some early media portrayals cast her as an Eve leading Adam astray in the Garden of Sin. But with time, the narrative has become more sympathetic, recognizing Margaret Chandler as a complex individual caught in an extraordinary story, not of her own making. The unresolved nature of the case allowed it to live on in Australian cultural memory in a way a solved case might not. It became a kind of modern folklore. Who or what killed Bogle and Chandler? For decades, that question lingered, passed down almost like a ghost story to each new generation. Novelists refer to it. Playwrights wrote stage plays inspired by it, and it has been the subject of multiple books and countless articles. Jeffrey Chandler's own book in 1969 was one of the first insider accounts, but others followed. In the 1980s and 1990s, the case was often revisited in retrospectives of famous Australian crimes, usually filed under Unsolved Mysteries, alongside cases like the Pajama Girl or the Beaumont children's disappearance. Even after Peter Butt's documentary in 2006, which to many effectively solved the case, the story continues to fascinate. There is something haunting about the image of those two covered bodies by the river, something that resonates with our primal fear of the unknown. In a 2018 radio segment on the Dictionary of Sydney, a historian noted that the tale has intrigued Sydney-siders since 1963, and recounted how each retelling of the mystery brings with it the attitudes of its time. For instance, a retelling in the conservative 1960s stressed moral lessons. One in the conspiracy-prone 1980s emphasized espionage. And modern takes have been keen on the science of the gas theory and empathy for the individuals. For the families involved, the decades were doubtless difficult. Gilbert Bogle's wife Vivian had to endure not only the loss of her husband, but the very public airing of his infidelities. She quietly took her children and moved on with life, largely outside the limelight. Jeffrey Chandler, for his part, remained in Australia and lived until 1991. Despite writing his book, he never fully escaped suspicion in the court of public opinion. Some whispers always followed him, though officially he was never charged with anything. One imagines he carried a burden of guilt, warranted or not, for having nudged Margaret towards Bogle, and thus, inadvertently, towards her fate. Their two children grew up without their mother, likely shielded as much as possible from the media. Margaret's extended family, including her brother Tony Morfitt, kept her memory alive while also suffering through each new wave of speculation about her death. And what of the location itself, the lovers laying by Lane Cove River? Today, it is part of a tranquil riverside park. The area around Fuller's Bridge has walking trails and picnic spots. The mangroves still line the muddy banks, and at low tide, you might even catch a slight sulfurous whiff from the black sediment, a faint reminder of the hidden danger that possibly lurked there. There is no marker or sign noting what happened. Casual visitors might never guess that one of Australia's great mysteries played out on that innocuous patch of ground. But local lore, no doubt, has imbued it with a certain eeriness. One can imagine that for years afterwards, people would point and say, "That's where those two were found dead." Perhaps somewhat embellish the story for dramatic effect, when telling friends, adding ghostly apparitions or star-crossed lover motifs, as often happens with infamous sites. Yet, at dawn or dusk, when the light is dim and the mind wanders, it's easy to feel a somber presence there. Not a ghost in the supernatural sense, but the weight of unanswered questions and lives cut short. In Australian true crime annals, the Bogle Chandler case taught several lessons. It showed the importance of preserving evidence. Unfortunately, tissue samples were not well preserved. Many were destroyed after initial tests, which later hampered new analysis. It highlighted the need for interdisciplinary thinking. If environmental scientists and medical examiners had collaborated more in 1963, hydrogen sulfide might have been considered sooner, and it certainly underscored how quickly a media frenzy can form when sex and mystery collide, perhaps at the expense of clear-eyed investigation. Yet, in closing our gentle narrative of this case, we return to the human level. Two people went out on New Year's Eve, seeking a bit of joy and freedom, and never returned. The quiet that enveloped them in their final moments is something we can almost feel when we picture that misty river scene. There is a sorrow in imagining Dr. Bogle, a man of science and music. He was a talented pianist and linguist too, struck down not by malice, but by a quirk of nature. And in picturing Margaret, a woman yearning for more vibrant life than her role allowed, finding an illicit happiness, only to have it snuffed out as dawn broke. These thoughts are melancholy, but in the spirit of a hypnotic bedtime story, perhaps we can also find a note of peace. In one sense, the mystery having been likely solved by science allows us to put to rest the notion of a lurking murderer. It replaces it with an understanding that fate can play cruel tricks. The calm of the river belied a danger, and in that contrast lies the eerie poetry of the tale. As you imagine the Lane Cove River now, perhaps in the late twilight or early dawn, picture it as it might be today, serene, the water moving in gentle ripples, birds skimming the surface. The events of 1963 aren't visible in that landscape, known only through words and memories. But stories like this one act as a subtle current, passing on lessons and legacies. The Bogle Chandler mystery has been recounted in hushed voices to those who love a good enigma. It has become the stuff of late-night radio shows, in true crime podcasts, of historical essays, and yes, even soothing narratives like this. Because sometimes there is comfort in walking through a mystery and emerging on the other side with greater understanding. In the end, we might consider that Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler inadvertently left us a puzzle that spurred curiosity and collaboration across disciplines and generation. In resolving to the best of our knowledge what happened to them, we also peel back a little bit of the world's complexity, and that can be oddly reassuring. The unknown becomes known, the frightening becomes explainable. Still, a tiny corner of mystery remains, just enough to keep the legend alive. If one stands by the river's edge on a quiet New Year's morning, one might contemplate the fragility of life and the unpredictability of destiny. In that reflection, Gilbert and Margaret's story lives on, not as a terrifying unsolved crime, but as a somber, poignant chapter in the annals of unsolved deaths that finally found a voice through science. As we close this narrative, let the image of the river fade to night. The cicadas hum a lullaby. In the story, settle comfortably in your mind. The Bogle Chandler mystery, once a tale of chaos and scandal, can now be seen as a tale of nature's whisper in a time capsule of an era. It remains a strangely beautiful enigma, one that when told softly and slowly can indeed accompany a listener into a contemplative, dreamy sleep, with the reassurance that even the darkest mysteries may eventually yield to the light of understanding.